Joel Donovan had not spoken a full sentence to another human being in 11 days, and he had been perfectly content with that arrangement until the morning Mamie Lawson drove her wagon straight into the fence post he had spent the better part of 3 weeks building. The sound of splintering wood cracked across the stillness of the Arizona territory like a rifle shot, and Joel was off his porch and halfway across the yard before the dust had settled, his boots eating up the dry ground with long, furious strides. The sun had barely cleared the ridge of the Dragoon Mountains to the east, and already the day was conspiring against him. He rounded the corner of the barn to find a woman sitting very upright on the wagon seat, both hands still gripping the reins with white-knuckled determination, staring at the wreckage of his fence post with an expression that was not quite shame and not quite defiance but some precise combination of both. The horse in the traces was a sorry-looking roan with ribs that showed through its coat, and it had the defeated expression of an animal that had long ago made its peace with catastrophe. "That," Joel said, pointing at the splintered post with one finger, "took me 3 weeks." The woman turned to look at him. She was somewhere in her middle 20s, with dark hair coming loose from its pins after what appeared to have been a very long journey, and eyes the color of strong coffee that regarded him with a steadiness he found immediately irritating. There was a streak of red dust across her left cheekbone, and her traveling dress was the worse for wear, but she sat that wagon seat like she was on a throne. "I am aware," she said. "The fence post made itself known to me quite forcefully." Joel opened his mouth, then closed it. In the 11 days since he had last spoken to a human being, he had rehearsed no conversation that covered this particular situation. He looked at the post, then back at the woman, then at the roan horse which blinked at him apologetically. "Where are you headed?" he finally managed. "Wherever this is," she said. "Are you Joel Donovan?" The fact that she knew his name did not improve his disposition. "Who's asking?" She reached into the bag beside her on the seat and produced a folded letter, holding it out to him with the steady patience of someone who had dealt with difficult men before and had simply decided not to be hurried by them. He walked to the wagon and took the letter. It was from his brother Patrick, who had gone east to St. Louis 3 years ago and had apparently lost his mind there. The letter was dated 6 weeks prior and explained, in Patrick's sprawling handwriting, that he had met a woman named Mamie Lawson who was in a difficult situation, having recently lost her father to pneumonia and her employment to a mill owner who had decided he did not need a bookkeeper once his wife's nephew came of age, and that Joel was to give her shelter and work at the ranch until she found her footing. And that if Joel refused, Patrick would come to Arizona himself and make his life considerably more complicated, which was not an empty threat. Joel read the letter twice. Then he folded it very carefully and looked up at Mamie Lawson. "My brother," he said slowly, "did not think to send a telegraph ahead. He sent 2, she said. "I believe they may not have reached you. I don't go to town." A pause settled between them. A roadrunner dashed across the yard with great purpose and disappeared into the scrub brush. Somewhere distant a hawk called out over the flats. "How long is a while?" Joel asked. "His letter says until you find your footing." "I intend to find it quickly," Mamie said, and she said it without apology or pleading, just a simple statement of fact that he found, against his will, slightly more tolerable than most things people said to him. He looked at the wrecked fence post again. He looked at the roan horse. He looked at the woman on the wagon seat who had driven 600 miles from St. Louis to a ranch she had never seen based on the word of a man's brother she had met 3 weeks ago, and who was sitting there watching him with those steady coffee-dark eyes without any apparent anxiety about what his answer would be. "You'll fix the post," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I'll show you where the tools are. That would be helpful." He turned and walked back toward the barn, and after a moment he heard her climbing down from the wagon seat, and then the soft crunch of her boots on the dry Arizona ground as she followed him. He did not look back. If he had, he might have noticed the very small, very brief smile that crossed her face as she walked. The ranch was called the Double D, which Patrick had named with characteristic sentimentality for their father, David Donovan, who had broken this land out of the desert floor in 1864 and raised his sons on it until the elder of those sons had taken it over at 23 after their father's heart gave out one November morning in 1879. That made Joel 30 years old in 1886, though the way he carried himself suggested a man who had been approximately 45 years old since birth. The land itself was extraordinary. The ranch sat in a broad valley south of Tombstone, with the Dragoon Mountains in one direction and the Mule Mountains in another, and in between stretched miles of grassland that turned to gold in the August heat and back to green again with the winter rains. Joel ran cattle on it, about 200 head, with the help of two ranch hands named Clem and Douglas who lived in the bunkhouse, and had learned within their first week of employment that the way to get along with Joel Donovan was to do their work and not ask him personal questions. Mamie spent her first afternoon on the Double D repairing the fence post. She was not entirely sure what she was doing, but she applied herself to it with the same thoroughness she applied to everything, asking Joel twice for guidance and not requiring a third time. By the evening she had it back up, perhaps not as architecturally perfect as before, but solid, and Joel walked out and tested it with both hands and said nothing, which she had already gathered was his version of approval. He had given her the small room at the back of the house that had once been a study of sorts, with a single window that looked out over the yard toward the mountains. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers, and the window let in the morning light first thing, which she appreciated. She unpacked her trunk that evening while the smell of the supper she had cooked drifted through the house, beans and salt pork and cornbread, the same supper she suspected Joel had been making for himself for the better part of a decade. He ate in silence. She did not attempt to fill it. She ate her own supper and looked out the window at the dark mountains against the darker sky and thought about how far from St. Louis she was, and decided it did not frighten her as much as perhaps it ought to. "Clem and Douglas eat in the bunkhouse," Joel said when supper was nearly done. "I noticed. You can cook for them too if you have a mind to. I pay them in wages. I'd pay you similarly." She looked at him across the table. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his plate with the focused attention of a man eating his beans, but his ears were doing something she would come to recognize over time, a slight tension in the line of his jaw that meant he was waiting for a response with more interest than he intended to show. "What are you paying Clem and Douglas?" he told her. "I'll cook for them," she said, "for an additional 10%. He looked up then. It was the first time he had looked directly at her since the fence post, and his eyes were a pale, clear gray that reminded her of winter sky, surprising in a face that was otherwise as weathered and brown as the desert itself. 8%, he said. 9. Another pause. The roadrunner was gone. The mountains were very still. 9, he agreed and went back to his supper. The days took on a rhythm after that, the way days do in a place where the work is hard and the sun is reliable. Mamie was up before first light to start breakfast, feeding 4 people, then spent the mornings on whatever needed doing in the house, which was considerable since it was apparent no one had touched it in a thorough way for years. The afternoons she often spent on the accounts, because Joel had a ledger book that was a masterpiece of good intentions and poor organization, and she had simply picked it up one afternoon, looked at it for 10 minutes, and started reorganizing it from the beginning. She had not asked permission for that either. Joel discovered what she was doing on the 3rd day. He came into the kitchen to find her at the table with the ledger open and his receipts spread in front of her in neat piles, annotating in her small, precise hand. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She did not look up. "I did not ask you to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. A long moment passed. She turned a page. "You have been overcharged for fencing wire for 3 years," she said. "The supplier in Tombstone has been adding a carrying fee that is not in your original contract. You are owed approximately $60. Joel walked to the table and stood over the ledger. She pointed out the relevant columns. He studied them for what felt like a very long time. "I'll speak to Hargrove," he said finally. "I have already drafted the letter," she said. "It is on the desk." He went to the desk and read the letter. It was precise and polite and completely without equivocation, the kind of letter that made its point so cleanly there was no reasonable argument to be made against it. He set it back down. "I'll mail it tomorrow," he said. "I thought I might ride to town and deliver it in person," she said. "It tends to be more effective. You'd need a horse." "I was going to ask to borrow one." He considered this. She waited. He was beginning to notice, extraordinarily patient. Not the passive patience of someone who had given up, but the active patience of someone who had simply decided that time was on her side and there was no point in rushing anything. "Take the bay mare," he said. "She's easy going." "Thank you." He went back outside. He stood in the yard for a moment in the afternoon heat, listening to the dry wind come off the mountains, and tried to identify exactly what it was about Mamie Lawson that unsettled him. She did not push. She did not chatter. She did not ask him about his feelings or his plans, or why he never went to town. She simply arrived each morning with her quiet, steady presence and got on with things, and the house smelled like coffee and clean linen, and his accounts were organized for the first time in memory. And somehow all of this was the most disconcerting thing that had happened to him in years. Mamie rode to Tombstone the next morning. It was June of 1886, and Tombstone had settled considerably from its riotous peak in the early part of the decade. The silver mines that had made it famous were struggling with water problems that no one had yet solved, and many of the businesses had thinned, though the town still had its saloons and its churches and its general commerce, and the people who remained were the people who had decided, for one reason or another, that this particular piece of desert was worth staying in. She delivered the letter to Hargrove's supply store herself, placing it in the man's hand and waiting while he read it. He was a heavy-set man with a politician's smile and small, calculating eyes, and the smile became somewhat more fixed as he reached the bottom of the letter. "The Donovan Ranch," he said. "That is correct," Mamie said. "We expect the adjustment within the month." She noted the way his expression shifted at the word "we," as if he was reassessing what he was dealing with. She let him do it. She had spent several years managing accounts for a mill in St. Louis, and she had learned that men like Hargrove responded better to a settled certainty than to any amount of argument. "I'll look into it," Hargrove said. "I'm sure you will," Mamie said pleasantly, and left. She stopped at the dry goods store for supplies, and at the post office, where she collected 3 weeks of mail that had been sitting uncollected because Joel did not go to town. She was looking through the letters on the post office step when a woman's voice said, "You must be the new one out at the Donovan place." Mamie looked up. The woman was perhaps 40, with a kind face and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent decades looking into an Arizona sun. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clara Webb, who ran the boarding house on Allen Street with her husband. "Word travels," Mamie observed. "Honey, word doesn't travel in this town. It practically flies." Clara Webb sat down on the step beside her with the ease of someone who sat on steps regularly. "How are you finding Joel Donovan?" Mamie considered the question honestly. "He is direct," she said, "and thorough, and the most determinedly self-sufficient person I have ever encountered." Clara Webb laughed, a genuine sound that made several people on the street turn to look. "That is the most diplomatic description of that man I have heard in 30 years of knowing him. He came out here with his father as a boy of 12, and I don't think he's asked anybody for a thing since." She looked at Mamie with a curiosity that was warm enough to forgive. "Are you managing?" "Quite well," Mamie said. "He is not unkind." "No," Clara agreed more quietly. "He is not that, he just—" She paused, searching for it. "He decided a long time ago that people leave. His mother left when the boys were young. His father died. Patrick went east. The woman he was supposed to marry in '82 went to Tucson with a railroad man instead. He's decided it's simpler to not let anyone in far enough to leave." Mamie absorbed this. She looked at the letters in her lap and thought about a man who had built a fence post over 3 weeks and been genuinely distressed when it was knocked down. "Thank you," she said to Clara Webb, and meant it for more than just the information. She rode back to the Double D in the long afternoon light with the saddlebag full of supplies, and the mail sorted in order of urgency. Joel was at the corral working with a young horse when she came back, and he glanced up once as she passed and then went back to the horse, and she went inside and started supper. When he came in for the evening meal, she set the mail beside his plate. He looked at it. "Hargrove will adjust the account," she said. He looked at her then. He agreed. He was persuaded, she said, and served the beans. He picked up the mail and sorted through it, and she noticed that he did it with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything, as if he had decided early in life that carelessness was the enemy and had simply refused to make peace with it. At the bottom of the pile he found a letter, and something happened in his face, a tightening around the eyes, so brief and controlled she might have missed it if she had not been paying attention. He set the letter aside and ate his supper without commenting on it. She did not ask. Later that night, when the dishes were done and the lamp was burning low, she heard him on the porch. She finished her reading and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the coyotes call across the flats, and thought that there were some silences that were not emptiness but something else entirely, the kind that had weight and texture and depth to them. The letter was from the railroad. She found out 2 days later, not because he told her, but because the representative arrived in person. He was a neat man in a town suit who came in a hired buggy from Tombstone and introduced himself as Mr. Carter of the Southern Pacific. And he wanted, he said, to discuss the matter of the railway easement through the south pasture of the Double D. Joel received him on the porch with the courteous rigidity of a man who had been expecting an unwelcome visitor and had prepared himself accordingly. Mamie brought out coffee because it was what you did, and because she was curious enough about the conversation to find a reason to stay nearby. The matter, as it emerged in pieces over the next hour, was this. The Southern Pacific wanted to route a spur line through a corner of the Double D's south pasture, and they were offering compensation, reasonable compensation by any objective measure, and they had the legal authority to proceed regardless of Joel's agreement if they chose to exercise it. But the representative had been sent first to negotiate, which meant that someone at the railroad had looked at Joel Donovan's file and decided that a man like this required diplomacy. Joel listened to all of it with his arms crossed and his gray eyes moving from Carter's face to the middle distance and back, in the measuring way he had of looking at things he was deciding about. When Carter was finished, Joel said, "No," Carter blinked. "Mr. Donovan, I want to be clear that the compensation offered is quite generous. It's my land," Joel said. "Yes, but the easement would only affect—" "No." Mamie, who had been standing inside the door, put down the coffee pot and stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Carter," she said, "perhaps you could leave the proposed agreement with us. We'd like to review the specifics before responding." Carter looked at her with the hopeful expression of a man seeing a reasonable shore after a stormy sea. Of course, of course." He produced the document from his bag and held it out. Joel looked at her. She looked back at him with perfect serenity. Carter handed her the document and made his farewells and drove his buggy back toward town, and when he was gone Joel turned to her and said, in a voice that was very controlled, "I said no." "I know," she said. "But you might want to read it before you say no again." "I don't need to read it, it's my south pasture." "Yes," she agreed, "and you might have very good reasons to keep it exactly as it is, but you should read it first." He took the document from her with the resigned air of a man who had said no and found it had not entirely taken, which was, she suspected, a relatively new experience for him. He read it on the porch while she went back to her work. An hour later he came to the kitchen. "The easement affects 12 acres, he said, "out of a total of 300. "I know," she said, not looking up from the account book. "I read it while Carter was talking." A pause. "The compensation would cover the new water tank I've been deferring. That was my calculation as well. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, not speaking, and she waited, not rushing, because she had already understood something essential about Joel Donovan, which was that he arrived at decisions in his own time, and at his own pace, and any attempt to accelerate that process made him dig in. But if you simply laid the facts out in front of him and stepped back, he was actually a very thorough and logical thinker. "I'll write back to Carter," he said. "I can draft the letter." "I'll write it myself," he said. And then, after a pause that she thought was as close as he knew how to come to saying thank you without actually saying it, "But you can look it over after." She permitted herself a small smile, directed at the ledger book. "All right," she said. July came in with a vengeance. The summer heat in the Arizona territory was not the casual warmth of other places but a physical force, a pressing, insistent weight that turned the sky to white by mid-morning and made the desert floor shimmer in waves all afternoon. The cattle retreated to the shade of the canyon walls, and the men worked early and late and rested in the heat of the day, which was simply the sensible thing to do, and anyone who said otherwise had not spent a July in this country. Mamie adapted. She had grown up in Missouri, which had its own opinion about summers, and she found that if she rose early enough and did her heaviest work before 9, she could manage the rest of the day tolerably. She began getting up before 5, and discovered that Joel was already awake and moving at 4:30, a fact that she accepted without comment because it seemed like something he had always done and would always do regardless of anyone else's schedule. They developed the habit, in those early pre-dawn mornings, of being in the kitchen at the same time without ceremony. She would make coffee and he would have it, and they would sit across from each other at the table in the lamplight while the darkness turned blue and then gray outside the window, and they would discuss the day's work and the accounts and the weather and whatever needed discussing, and sometimes they would not speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and that was equally fine. It was in one of these silences, on a Tuesday in mid-July, that Joel said, without any preamble, "Patrick wrote." She looked up. He was looking at his coffee cup. "He's doing well," Joel said. "His business is growing. He's talking about staying east permanently." She heard what he was not saying, which was that this was the last tie severing, the last direction the word home had pointed, closing off. "Is that hard for you?" she asked, not carefully, just directly. He looked at her then with a kind of surprise that told her he was not used to direct questions, or perhaps not used to questions that assumed he had interior states worth inquiring about. "Patrick makes his own choices," Joel said. "That's not what I asked." A very long pause. The sky outside the kitchen window was the deepest blue before dawn breaks. "He's the only family I have left," Joel said, quietly and without inflection, as if he were reporting a weather condition. Mamie did not say she was sorry because she thought he would find it hollow, and she did not say Patrick might change his mind because she thought he would find it dishonest, and she did not reach across the table and pat his hand, though something in her wanted to, because she thought he would not know what to do with it. She simply stayed where she was and let the silence settle around what he had said, like earth settling around a new planting. After a moment she said, "I have no family either. My mother died when I was 15, my father, as you know, last year." He looked at her. "I didn't know about your mother. Patrick probably did not think to mention it." "No," he said. "Then 15. It was hard," she said simply, "and then it became the shape of things the way it does." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow rotation that she had come to recognize as his version of working something out. "You managed." "I managed," she agreed. "You managed too. It's not the same as being all right with it." "No," she said, "it is not." The sky broke light outside the window, and he stood and took his hat from the hook and went out to start the day. And she sat for a moment in the kitchen alone, and thought that she had just seen further into Joel Donovan than she suspected anyone had in a very long time, and that he did not entirely seem to have noticed, which was probably how it had to happen. Clem and Douglas had formed their own opinion of the situation at the Double D and kept it mostly between themselves. Clem was a Texas man of 40 with a drooping mustache who had worked cattle since he was 17 and had seen most of what there was to see on the frontier. Douglas was younger, perhaps 26, with a cheerful, freckled face and the conversational enthusiasm of someone who had not yet been worn smooth by the world. It was Douglas who made the mistake, on a Saturday evening at the end of July, of saying at supper in the bunkhouse, "She's good for him, though, isn't she? Miss Lawson." Clem had looked at him with the patient exhaustion of a man watching a bird fly toward glass. "If you say that to him," Clem said, "I will deny I ever knew you." "I'm not going to say it to him. I'm just saying it to you. And I am telling you for your own welfare to think about something else entirely." Douglas ate his supper in thoughtful silence for a while. Then he said, "Do you think he knows?" "He knows," Clem said. "He just hasn't figured out what to do about it yet." "How long do you think that'll take?" Clem considered this with the genuine seriousness it deserved. With Joel Donovan, could be spring, could be never. Douglas reflected on this. "She'll wait," he said eventually, with the certainty of someone who had been paying attention. Clem looked at him, and something in his expression acknowledged that this, at least, was an accurate observation. "Yeah," he said, "I think she might." August brought its own drama in the form of a dry lightning storm that set fire to the ridge on the east side of the property on a Sunday night. Joel was up and out of the house before the crack of thunder had finished its work, moving toward the barn with the instinctive speed of a man who had grown up on this land and knew exactly what a fire on that ridge meant for the cattle in the east pasture. Mamie was behind him. She had been awake, too, watching the storm come in through her window, and she had been dressed and waiting because she had looked at the ridge and understood what it meant even without 20 years of history on this land to guide her. "The east gate," she said, coming up beside him in the yard. "The cattle will need to be moved." "I know," he said. "I need you to go back inside. You need 4 people to move those cattle, not 3. He turned to look at her in the erratic light of the approaching storm. The fire on the ridge was a thin orange line against the dark sky, and the wind was pushing it wrong. "Mamie, I have ridden horses my whole life," she said. "Tell me what to do." He looked at her for a long, measuring second. Then he said, "Stay on the bay, mare. Stay behind me. When I give you a direction, you go without argument." Agreed. They moved the cattle. It was 2 hours of hard, loud work in darkness broken by lightning and smoke, with Clem and Douglas driving the flanks and Joel at the head, and Mamie holding the rear line, keeping the panicking animals together with a combination of controlled riding and sheer nerve. The fire burned along the ridge and dropped back when the wind shifted around midnight, and by 2 in the morning the cattle were in the west pasture and the danger had passed. They stood at the fence in the dark, the 4 of them, breathing hard, the horses blowing and the cattle settling, and the smell of smoke and sage and hot earth surrounding them in the quiet that comes after. Joel was standing next to her at the fence, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cooled night air. She could see in his profile that something had shifted in the last 2 hours. Some small, reluctant revision was taking place in him. "Good work," he said, and he said it to all of them, Clem and Douglas too, but he was looking at her when he said it. She nodded. Clem and Douglas took the horses back to the barn. Joel and Mamie stood at the fence a moment longer, looking at the ridge where the fire had burned itself out, and the stars were showing again through the thinning smoke. "Thank you," he said then, quietly, just to her. "Of course," she said. They walked back to the house in the dark, not speaking, and she went to her room and he to his, and she lay in her narrow bed and listened to the coyotes and the cooling desert and felt something warm and settled in her chest that she did not yet name. The $60 came from Hargrove at the end of August, exactly as the letter had specified. Joel brought it in from the post office on one of his rare town trips, which he had been making slightly more frequently since she had mentioned that the mail was accumulating. He set the bank draft on the kitchen table in front of her without comment. She looked at it. "That is satisfying," she said. "It is," he agreed, and there was the very faint suggestion of something pleased in his expression, a warmth around the eyes that she had learned to watch for because it lasted only a moment. "The water tank," she said. "Next month." She returned to the ledger. He sat down at the other end of the table with the newspaper he had brought from town, and for a while they read in companionable silence, and outside the window the late August light went golden over the mountains, and the ranch sat quiet and whole around them. At some point he set the paper down and looked at her. She looked up. "You're not going to leave," he said. It was not a question. Or perhaps it was, but it was phrased as a statement because he did not quite know how to ask questions like this without making himself vulnerable, and vulnerability was a thing he had concluded long ago was simply not worth the cost. She held his gaze steadily. "No," she said, "I'm not going to leave." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away, and she did not fill the silence with reassurance or explanation. She had said what was true, and she let it stand. He picked up his newspaper. But she noticed, before he did, that his hands had the very slightest tension in them, and that he read the same paragraph twice, and that when he finally set the paper down and looked out the window at the mountains his face had the expression of a man working out something fundamental, some recalculation of a long-established position. She did not say anything about any of this. She went back to the ledger. September came, and with it the first softening of the heat. The mornings were cool again, and the afternoons merely warm, and the grass in the valley came up green after a week of good rain, and the cattle spread out across the pastures with the contented ease of animals who had come through the summer and found the world intact on the other side. Mamie had been at the Double D for 3 months. She had organized every record Joel owned going back 4 years. She had negotiated, or contributed to negotiating, the railroad easement, which had been accepted, and which was now funding the new water tank that was going in on the south end of the property. She had cooked approximately 370 meals, managed the household accounts, helped move cattle in a lightning storm, and ridden to Tombstone and back 8 times. She had also, without particularly planning to, become so woven into the fabric of the ranch that she no longer felt like a guest in it. She was sitting on the porch in the September evening, mending a tear in Joel's work shirt, when he came and sat down in the other chair. He did not usually sit on the porch. He had a chair there, but he mostly stood or leaned against the post, and she had noticed that he sat down in it only when he was working something out. "Clara Webb came by today," he said. She looked up. She knew Clara Webb had become a kind of informal friend to her over the summer, driving out to the ranch occasionally, and that Joel viewed these visits with the polite tolerance of a man who had decided his opinions about social calls were irrelevant to the people making them. "Did she? She brought a pie," he said. "She does that. She is a generous woman. She is." A pause. "She told me to stop being a fool." Mamie kept her face very still. "About what?" He turned his hat in his hands, the slow rotation she had come to know so well, the working-out gesture. He was looking at the mountains, purple in the evening light. "About you," he said. She set the shirt down in her lap. She said nothing because nothing was what was called for. "I am not good at this," he said. "I am aware of that. I have spent a considerable portion of my life actively avoiding being good at it." "I know," she said. He turned and looked at her. His gray eyes in the evening light were very clear, and she could see in them the effort this was costing him, not the effort of sentiment, he had plenty of that underneath, but the effort of allowing it to be visible. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Joel, I don't mean for practical reasons," he said. "I mean," he stopped. He looked at the mountains again. He took a breath. "I mean that the ranch is different with you in it. I am different. And I know I am not easy, and I know I have the social disposition of a fence post, which is perhaps an unfortunate comparison given our introduction, and I know—" "Joel," she said. He stopped. "I'm still here," she said. He looked at her. "I've been here," she said. "Every morning, every evening. I'm not going anywhere. I told you that." "I know you told me." "Then why do you look like a man who doesn't believe it?" He was quiet for a long moment. The evening birds started up in the scrub, and somewhere out in the pasture, a calf was calling for its mother with the particular insistence of young things that expect the world to respond to them. Because everyone I have counted on has left, he said, and his voice was very quiet and without self-pity, just a plain statement of accumulated fact. My mother, my father, even if not by choice, Patrick, Ellen, he paused on that last name and she heard the weight of it. And I know that is not a reason to expect you to leave. I know it is not logical, but it is the thing that is there. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I know what it is to lose everyone. I know what it makes you do to yourself, how you start making yourself smaller so there's less of you to lose, how you stop expecting things so you're not surprised when they don't come. He was very still. But I am not your mother, she said, and I am not Ellen, and I am not going to go to Tucson with a railroad man. I am 33 years into a life that has had very little steadiness in it, and I came to this ranch because your brother offered me a way forward, and I have stayed because she paused and looked at the mountains because it was easier, because I have found something here that I did not expect to find. A silence that had weight to it, the good kind. What did you find? He asked. She looked back at him. You, she said, more or less. He held her gaze, and something in his face, in those guarded gray eyes, shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical force that stories usually assign to such moments. Just a quiet, enormous unlocking, the way a door opens that has been shut for a very long time. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. She let him. His hand was large and very calloused and warm from the day, and he held hers with the careful, deliberate grip of a man who had decided to hold on to something and was not going to be careless about it. They sat on the porch until the stars came out full over the mountains, and the air was cool, and the ranch was quiet around them, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more was needed. The week that followed was, in the way of things after long-delayed arrivals, both startling and absolutely natural. Nothing about the daily routine of the Double D changed perceptibly. Joel still rose at 4:30. Mamie still had coffee ready. The cattle were tended and the accounts kept and the meals made, and Clem and Douglas maintained a scrupulous and obviously deliberate unawareness of any alteration in the domestic atmosphere of the main house. What changed was smaller and more significant than routine. Joel, who had maintained a physical distance from her that was perfectly correct and also faintly excruciating to observe, no longer seemed to feel the need to maintain it. He stood beside her at the kitchen table when they went over the accounts rather than across from her. He touched the small of her back briefly when they moved past each other in the narrow hallway, not thoughtfully, just because it was natural. He began saying good morning as if he meant it, which he always had, but now it was accompanied by the kind of direct, warm look that made the words do twice as much work. She noticed all of it. She said nothing about any of it, because she had learned that Joel Donovan moved at his own pace, and that the correct response to his advances was the same as the correct response to everything else about him. Receive them without alarm and without pressing for more than he was ready to offer. In the middle of September, his horse threw a shoe on the far end of the north pasture, and he walked back to the ranch in the afternoon heat leading the horse, arriving in the yard with the particular expression of a man who has had several hours to think and has thought thoroughly. She was at the corral when he came in. She took the horse from him without being asked and began looking at the hoof. I need to ask you something, he said. She kept her attention on the hoof. All right. I need to ask you properly. I know how to do it properly. I have simply been stubborn, she said. A pause. Yes. She set the horse's hoof down and straightened and looked at him. He was sunburned and dusty from the walk, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and he was looking at her with those clear gray eyes that were doing their full measure of work. I am aware, he said, that I have no particular charm to recommend me. I am aware that I have been difficult and closed off and have not made any of this easy. I am aware that you came here for a temporary situation and have stayed longer than you perhaps intended, and I am further aware that you have been the most patient person I have ever encountered and that I have not deserved it. She waited. Mamie, he said, would you stay, not on wages, not as an employee, would you stay as my wife? The word had clearly cost him something. It sat between them in the dry September air, plain and enormous and very earnest. She looked at him for a long, measured moment, long enough that he had just begun to look like a man bracing for a verdict, and then she said, "Yes, Joel, I will stay as your wife." He exhaled, a long breath that was also something else, something released. "I will try to be less of a fence post," he said. She almost laughed, and she did not quite manage to stop it, and the smile that broke across her face was the full one, the one she had been keeping carefully in reserve for months, and something in his expression when he saw it was like a man seeing a sunrise for the first time. He crossed the space between them and took both her hands, and she looked up at him, and he said, "I mean that." "I know you do," she said, "and I will hold you to it." He kissed her then, finally, with the particular restrained tenderness of a man who had been cautious for a very long time, and was only now permitting himself otherwise. And she kissed him back with the warmth of a woman who had known for quite some time that this was where things were going, and had simply been willing to wait until he arrived. Clem, who happened to be passing on the other side of the barn and came around the corner at precisely this moment, stopped, turned entirely around without breaking stride, and went back the way he had come. When he reached the bunkhouse, he sat down on his bunk and looked at Douglas. "Spring," Douglas said, without looking up from his boot that he was mending. "September," Clem said. Douglas looked up. Then he smiled, the broad, satisfied smile of a man who has been proven right about something that mattered. "Good," Douglas said. They were married in October in Tombstone at the church on Toughnut Street, which was a small adobe building that held warmth even as the October mornings began to carry the first edge of winter. Clara Webb stood with Mamie, and looked as pleased as a woman who felt she had contributed materially to the outcome. The minister was a steady, patient man named Reverend Aldrich, who had officiated at enough frontier weddings to know that the emotion in the room was usually not centered in the person crying. And in this case, the person crying was Clara Webb, and the emotion was centered in the two people standing at the front, who were not crying but who were looking at each other with the focused certainty of people who have made a serious decision and intend to honor it. Clem and Douglas attended and wore their good shirts, and sat in the front pew with the stiff dignity of men who would die before admitting they found the occasion moving, which they did. Joel said his vows without faltering, looking directly at Mamie the entire time, and his voice was steady and grave, and meant every word with the literal thoroughness he brought to everything. Mamie said hers with a clarity that rang out in the small adobe room, and when she said "I do," she said it with her chin up and her coffee-dark eyes steady. And the minister, who had heard these words 10,000 times, said afterward to Clara Webb that that particular "I do" had been one of the more convincing ones he had encountered in 30 years of ministry. They rode back to the Double D in the afternoon, just the two of them, because Clem and Douglas had offered with transparent generosity to handle the evening chores, and the ranch was quiet and golden in the low autumn light when they arrived. Joel helped her down from the wagon with the careful, formal courtesy that sat oddly with his usual economy of gesture, and she looked at him standing in the yard of the ranch that was now hers as much as his, and she thought about the morning 6 months ago when she had driven a wagon into his fence post, and she almost said something about it and then decided it could wait. Instead she said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." He looked at her with those winter sky eyes, and the corner of his mouth moved in what was unmistakably a smile, which was not precisely rare anymore but was still worth noting every time it happened. "Yes," he said. "All right." October deepened into November, and November brought its own gifts to the Arizona territory. The mornings were cold now, and the mountains showed white on their peaks, and the valley grass turned the color of old honey in the low autumn sun. The cattle were fat from the summer range, and the ranch was in better order than it had been in years, the accounts straight, and the fencing repaired, and the new water tank installed on the south end. Life at the Double D settled into its married shape, which was not so different from what it had been, because Joel and Mamie were already people who knew how to share a space with the other without crowding them. But it was different in the ways that mattered. There was a warmth in the house that had not been there before, a kind of presence that lived in the details, in the way he sought her out when he had something to think through, in the way she reached for his hand sometimes without any particular reason, in the way the silence between them, which had always been friendly, was now simply home. He was, she was finding, a surprisingly thoughtful man once you got past the considerable external fortifications. He remembered things she mentioned in passing. He had brought her, without comment, a copy of a novel she had mentioned wanting to read, left it on her side of the washstand as if it had materialized there. He was not romantic in any conventional sense, but he was consistent, and she had come to believe that consistency was its own kind of romance, quieter and more durable than the other sort. He was also, in the privacy of their life together, less impenetrable than he was to the world at large. He talked in the evenings, in a way he apparently had not talked in years, about the ranch and what he wanted for it, about his father and the years of building, about Patrick and the complicated mix of pride and loss that came with his brother's choice to stay east. He told her about Ellen, the woman who had gone to Tucson, briefly and without bitterness, because he had clearly worked through the bitterness a long time ago and arrived at something cooler and more settled. She told him about her years in St. Louis, the mill and the work, and the particular loneliness of being competent and female in an industry that wanted neither. She told him about her father, a gentle man who had been good at losing things gradually and had never quite found his footing after her mother died, and how she had managed the household from 15 onward with the determined practicality of someone who had decided that grief was allowed but could not be the main enterprise. He listened to all of it with the complete and quiet attention he gave to everything that he considered worth his time, which was not everything, but which she clearly was. A letter from Patrick came in November, full of warmth and obvious delight at the news of the marriage, which Clara Webb had communicated east with what Mamie suspected was considerable embellishment. Patrick wrote that he was glad Joel had finally done the intelligent thing, and that Mamie was clearly a woman of extraordinary patience and good sense, and Joel read this letter 3 times and then set it on the mantel, which she noted was where he put things he wanted to keep close. Winter came gently to the valley that year. The snows were light and the cold, while real, was the kind that made mornings brilliant and afternoons forgiving. Joel and Mamie moved through December with the steady warmth of people who had found the right shape for their lives and were settled in it. It was in the first week of December that she told him. She had known for several weeks, but she had wanted to be sure, and she had been sure for 10 days, and she was sitting at the breakfast table watching him read the morning paper when she said, "We'll need to plan for additional hands by summer." He looked up over the paper. "Why's that?" "Because I won't be riding much after March," she said, "given the circumstances." He looked at her. The paper lowered very slowly. She watched the information make its way through him, the way it did with Joel, not dramatically but thoroughly, each implication being considered in sequence, and then his face did something she had never quite seen it do. It opened, completely and without any of the usual careful management, into something so full and unguarded that it caught her off guard even knowing him as she now did. He set the paper down. He came around the table and sat beside her and took her face in both his hands with infinite care, as if he were holding something extraordinary which she supposed he was. "Mamie," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right? Are you—" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very well." He looked at her for a long moment and she looked back, and then he leaned forward and put his forehead against hers, and she felt the slight tremor in his hands that he would never in 1,000 years have admitted to, and she thought that this was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever seen from him. "A child," he said, quietly, as if testing the word and finding it almost too large. "A child," she confirmed. He straightened and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. The pure, overwhelming, slightly terrified expression of a man confronted by something good beyond his calculations. "We'll write Patrick," she said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised out of him, and she treasured it completely because she had learned that Joel Donovan's real laugh was not frequent but was absolutely worth waiting for. "We'll write Patrick," he agreed. Clem and Douglas were informed that same morning by Joel, which was itself a notable event. Joel went to the bunkhouse while they were still at their morning coffee and told them directly and without preamble. And Clem shook his hand with the gravely pleased expression of a man who felt he had contributed to the outcome through sheer patience, which in a way he had, and Douglas whooped and then looked embarrassed about it. And Joel tolerated both reactions with better grace than he would have tolerated most things. The winter passed in the warm, purposeful way of seasons that have good things to wait for. Mamie read everything she could find on the matter of children and the management thereof, which in Tombstone was limited, but which Clara Webb supplemented admirably from her own experience, being the mother of 4 grown children and an inexhaustible source of practical wisdom. Joel built things. He built a cradle, in the evenings by lamplight, with the same meticulous thoroughness he brought to fence posts, and the cradle was a beautiful piece of work, solid and smooth, and clearly intended to last for generations. She sat with him sometimes while he worked, reading or mending or simply watching him by lamplight, and she thought about the woman she had been insent. Louis, managing ledgers for a mill owner and coming home to a rented room and eating supper alone, and how completely different that life was from this one. This lamplight and this desert and this man across the room who was building a cradle for their child, with the focused devotion of someone who intended to do this right. Spring came back to the valley in March, and with it the return of the spectacular green that turned the ordinary grassland into something from a painting, and the cattle were restless with new energy, and Clem and Douglas were occupied constantly with the business of the season, calving and branding and driving the new stock to the upper pasture. Joel had arranged for a woman from Tombstone, a calm, experienced woman named Mrs. Perez, to be available when the time came. Mrs. Perez had attended more births in the territory than she had kept count of, and she arrived at the Double D in the first week of June with the composed efficiency of someone who had been summoned to do important work and intended to do it properly. The child came on a Thursday morning in early June of 1887, while the morning light was breaking gold over the Dragoon Mountains, and the meadowlarks were loud in the yard, and he was a healthy, vigorous boy who made his opinions known about the world from the first moment he was in it. Joel held his son for the first time in the doorway of the bedroom, and Mamie watched him from the bed, still tired but watching, because she did not want to miss this. He stood there in the June morning light holding this small, astonishing person with the same deliberate care he gave to everything he valued, and he looked at his son's face with an expression of such complete and undefended wonder that she felt it in her own chest like a struck bell. He looked at her. His gray eyes were brilliant in the light. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about it the way he thought about things, fully and without hurrying. "David," he said, "for my father." "David," she said. "Yes." David Donovan made himself at home with the energy and conviction of someone who had arrived with plans. He was loud and opinionated and very present, and the ranch, which had for so long been a place of deliberate quiet, adjusted around him with an ease that suggested it had been waiting for this kind of noise all along. Joel took to fatherhood with the same thoroughness he had applied to every other important thing in his life. He was not, given his nature, a man who made elaborate demonstrations, but he was constant, and David from his earliest weeks was aware that his father was there, that the large warm presence was reliable and enduring, and he responded to Joel with the absolute trust that children develop for reliable things. The summer of 1887 was a good one. The railroad easement money had been well spent, and the ranch was running with an efficiency it had not known before, the accounts precise and the system sound, and the cattle in excellent condition. Joel rode the pastures with an ease that had more satisfaction in it than it used to, because he was coming home to something now, and that made the space between the going and the returning different. Patrick came west that August. He had written 2 months prior to say he was coming, and Joel had said almost nothing about this in the interval, but Mamie noticed that he checked the road toward town with slightly more frequency than usual as the date approached. Patrick Donovan arrived on the afternoon stage from Tucson, which connected from the train, and Mamie saw immediately what Patrick's letters had conveyed, which was that he was a warmer and less guarded version of his brother, with the same gray eyes and his father's height. But where Joel was weathered and still, Patrick moved with the easy, open energy of a man at home in the world. He embraced Joel on the porch with the unceremonious warmth of a brother who had decided sentiment was allowed regardless of anyone's preferences, and Joel tolerated it with a stiffness that was clearly fighting something warmer underneath. And Patrick turned to Mamie with a grin that was genuine and delighted. "You are even better than Clara Webb described," he said, "and Clara Webb described you as a saint." "I am not a saint," Mamie said. "I am a bookkeeper." "In this case," Patrick said, "they may be equivalent." Joel made a sound that was almost a laugh. Patrick stayed 3 weeks. He was immediately devoted to David, his nephew, and carried him around with the shameless pleasure of an uncle who could enjoy an infant without the operational responsibilities, which made Joel observe on more than one occasion that it was convenient for some people. Patrick laughed and kept carrying the baby. In the evenings, the 3 of them sat on the porch, with David asleep inside, and the brothers talked in the easy, interrupted way of people who have been apart and are refilling a space that was always there. Mamie listened and contributed and felt no need to navigate the conversation or manage anything. It was simply good, the way evenings can be when the right people are in the same place at the same time. On his last evening, Patrick took Joel aside, and Mamie did not try to hear what was said, but she saw when they came back that Joel's face had the particular settled quality it got when something that had been unresolved had found its resolution. He sat beside her on the porch, and Patrick sat across from them, and they watched the mountains go purple in the evening. Patrick left the next morning. He and Joel embraced again on the porch, and this time there was less stiffness in it, as if the 3 weeks had done the work they were supposed to do. Patrick kissed Mamie on the cheek and told her she was too good for his brother, which Joel heard and responded to with a look that made Patrick laugh all the way to the buggy. They watched the buggy go down the road until it was a small shape in the dust, and then Joel put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the morning light while David made small sounds inside the house that meant he was waking up. "He's staying east," Joel said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "He's happy there. He seems very happy." A pause. "Good," he said, and meant it, fully and without reservation, which she knew was something he had worked to arrive at and had now arrived at completely. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. "We're all right," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." They went inside together to tend to their son. The following years at the Double D were the kind that accumulate into a life in the best possible way. The ranch grew steadily under the dual management of Joel's cattle sense and Mamie's organizational clarity, and by 1889, it was one of the better-run operations in that part of Arizona Territory, known among the cattle buyers in Tombstone and Tucson for the quality of its stock and the reliability of its contracts. Joel was, by the standards of his neighbors, a changed man. Clara Webb said this to Mamie with immense satisfaction on one of her visits, and Mamie said that he was the same man he had always been, just more of it, and Clara Webb had thought about this, and said that was perhaps a better way to put it. He remained, in all the ways that were fundamental to him, himself. He was not a man who chatted at length at the general store or who made friends with the easy, careless speed of more social men. He was not warm to strangers on sight or comfortable with large gatherings. He did not give speeches or make elaborate declarations. He was still the man who had not spoken to another human being for 11 days and found that reasonable, and he still regarded most of the world with the measured, assessing gaze of someone who was not giving his trust until he had decided it was warranted. But he had discovered, or perhaps simply allowed himself to know, that he was capable of more warmth than he had previously permitted, and that the people worth directing it toward were worth the risk of directing it. Mamie knew this about him in the way you know the particular color of light in a room you live in, not as a thought but as a settled fact. She was herself, shaped by the ranch and the life in it in ways she could not have anticipated in St. Louis. She was stronger than she had been, in the literal sense, from years of physical work in a demanding climate, and she was also more deeply rooted, in the way of people who have found the place where they belong and stopped looking. The desert, which had seemed vast and alien on that first morning when she had driven her wagon into the fence post, was now simply where she lived, and she had come to love it with the affectionate, particular love you develop for landscapes that have been part of your life for years, their seasons and their colors and their wild, austere beauty. In the spring of 1889, she told Joel she was expecting again. He received this news with considerably less of the barely contained astonishment of the first time and more of a deep, warm pleasure, though the care with which he held her face was the same. Their second child was a girl, born in December of 1889, on a cold night with stars so clear and close over the valley that it seemed you could touch them. They named her Ruth, for no particular reason except that it suited her immediately and they both felt it. Ruth was a different creature from David, quieter and more watchful, with Mamie's steady gaze and Joel's tendency to observe before acting. David, at 2.5 years old, received his sister with the generous enthusiasm of a child who had not yet learned to be territorial, and who found a new small person in the house entirely satisfying. The four of them arranged themselves into the shape of a family with the natural ease that Mamie had not entirely dared to hope for, in those early months at the Double D when she had been finding her footing and watching a guarded, stubborn man from a careful distance, and deciding that he was worth waiting for. Tombstone in 1890 was not what it had been in its roaring height. The mines had been flooded out and the big money had followed the water somewhere else, and many of the people who had come for the silver rush had moved on. But the town had found a quieter shape, a cattle town now more than a mining town, and the people who remained were the ones who were staying, and there was a settled community there that had its churches and its school and its commerce and its long memories. Joel began going to town more regularly. Not frequently, because frequent was not a word that was ever going to be naturally associated with Joel Donovan, but regularly, which was an improvement. He sat on the town council in a limited capacity and managed its affairs with the same thorough seriousness he gave everything, and the other council members had learned, as Clem and Douglas had learned years before, that arguing with him was less efficient than listening to him, and then making a decision with the benefit of what he had said. David Donovan at 4 was already a small version of his father in the way he moved through the world, with purpose and without wasted motion, though he had his mother's curiosity and her willingness to talk, and Joel watched his son with the expression of a man confronting his own temperament in a more agreeable package. Ruth at 1 was steadily, solemnly engaged with everything that came within her reach, which was becoming more because she had learned to walk with the same focused determination that characterized everything about her. Mamie sat on the porch one evening in October of 1890, with David leaning against her leg and Ruth asleep in her arms, watching Joel come back from the corral in the long evening light. He was 44 years old, and the country had put its mark on him in the lines at his eyes and the white at his temples, and he moved across the yard with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had decided it was where he wanted to be. He came up the porch steps and looked at his wife and his sleeping daughter and his son, and his face did the thing it had done on the day David was born, opened without any of its usual management into something clear and unguarded. He sat in the other chair, and David immediately relocated to lean against him instead, and he put his hand on the back of his son's head with the natural ease of a man who had practiced tenderness long enough that it had stopped requiring effort. Mamie looked at him across the sleeping Ruth. "Clem asked again about the north pasture fence," she said. "I'll see to it Thursday," he said. "Patrick wrote. I saw. He's thinking of coming west again next summer." "Good," Joel said, and then quietly, "good." The evening settled around them. The mountains went from purple to indigo to the dark gray of night, and the stars came out one by one, and the coyotes began their conversation out on the flats, and the ranch sat solid and whole around them all. David fell asleep against his father's side, and Joel shifted to accommodate him with the automatic care of a man who had learned to be mindful of small sleeping people, and Ruth slept on in Mamie's arms with the profound confidence of a child who had never had a reason to doubt that she was held. She looked at Joel. He was looking at the mountains. After a moment he felt her looking and turned, and in the starlight his gray eyes were very clear. "I didn't know what to do with you," he said. It was something he had said once before, approximately on a very different evening. "I know," she said. "I know what to do with you now." "Yes," she agreed. He reached across the space between the chairs, careful of the sleeping children on both sides of them, and took her hand, and she gave it, and they sat in the October evening on the porch of the ranch that was theirs, with their children sleeping in the warmth of them, and the mountains keeping watch over all of it in the dark. The years that followed were good ones. David grew up with the mountains in his blood and his mother's quick mind and his father's stubbornness, which Mamie observed would either make him very successful or very lonely, and she applied herself with some care to making sure it was the former. He was a bright and earnest boy who read everything he could find and who could also, by the time he was 8, ride and rope with a competence that made Clem say he was better than Joel had been at the same age, which Clem only said once because Joel was within earshot. Ruth grew into a girl of few words and considerable observation, who understood most things before they were explained to her, and who moved through the world with a steadiness that was her father's but warmer around the edges, her mother's influence visible in the small, deliberate kindnesses she offered to animals and people in difficulty. She was, Mamie thought privately, going to be formidable in the best possible sense. A third child came in 1893, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived with his own personality already fully formed, which was loud and joyful and oriented entirely toward whatever was most interesting in the immediate vicinity. Thomas was the one most unlike either of his parents and most like what their union at its most unexpected and delightful had produced, someone new. Joel held Thomas on the afternoon of his birth and looked at Mamie over the baby's head with an expression that had long since ceased to be surprised by how much his life had changed and had settled into a deep and genuine gratitude for it. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed, tired and pleased. "The ranch will need more hands," he said, and she could hear under the practical observation the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man building something, not just a cattle operation but a life, a family, a legacy that would run past him and carry his name forward into years he would not see. "We'll figure it out," she said. He smiled at her. Not the small, reluctant suggestion of a smile she had first catalogued on that September porch, but a full and real and deeply satisfied smile, the smile of a man who had decided long ago against being all right and had been argued out of that position by sheer patient persistence, and who had found on the other side of his own stubbornness something larger and finer and more durable than he had ever permitted himself to imagine. The ranch went on. The seasons turned. The mountains stood in their ancient place over the valley and watched the small, bright, significant business of human lives proceed beneath them. The cattle grazed and the accounts balanced, and the letters came from Patrick in the east and went back west from Arizona. And Clara Webb drove out to visit and brought pies that were always good and stayed for hours and left happier than she came, which was the measure of a successful visit in any century. Clem retired eventually and went back to Texas with a handshake from Joel that lasted a long time and communicated more than either man would have put into words. Douglas stayed on and became, over the years, something between an employee and a fixture, part of the ranch the way the barn was part of the ranch, simply there and reliable and known. Joel Donovan, who had been the most stubborn man on the Arizona frontier, who had gone 11 days without speaking to another person, and considered this a reasonable arrangement, who had built walls around himself with the same deliberate craft he brought to fence posts, had been waited out by the one person who understood that waiting was not passivity but its own kind of strength, its own kind of love. He knew this about himself in the end. He knew that Mamie had seen him clearly from the beginning, not the walls but the person behind them, and had simply refused to be discouraged by the distance between where he was and where he could be, and had waited with extraordinary patience and considerable steadiness until he had found his way across that distance himself, because that was the only way it could have worked with a man like him. He told her this once on a winter evening in 1895, when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet and the fire was burning, and the Dragoon Mountains were invisible in the dark outside the window but present the way things always present are, known even when unseen. He said, "I do not know what I would be without you. I know what I was before. I do not prefer it." She set down her mending and looked at him across the room, this man who had not changed in any fundamental way and had changed completely, who was still the most self-contained and stubborn and privately warm and thoroughly decent person she had ever encountered, who was her husband and the father of her children and the person across from her at every table and the hand that reached for hers in the dark. "You would have managed," she said. "Yes," he said, "but managing is not the same as this." "No," she agreed, "it is not." She went and sat beside him by the fire and he put his arm around her and the fire settled and the mountains were there in the dark and the ranch was quiet around them, whole and solid and deeply, completely theirs. And that was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the precise and exact and deeply satisfying sum of two people who had each been alone for a long time and had each, in their own way, been waiting, and who had found each other on a dry Arizona morning with a splintered fence post between them and had made, from that unlikely beginning, everything that mattered. The post office in Tombstone still had, behind the counter, a small ledger that recorded the names of residents in the surrounding area, and beside the entry for Joel and Mamie Donovan, Double D Ranch, south of town, someone had written in a neat hand, "Established 1886, which was technically when the ranch had been established by David Donovan Sr., but was also, in another and more important sense, the year that everything else had been established, the thing that mattered most, the life that had been waiting on both sides of that fence post to begin.